Across the Sun by Jason Pagano and Bill Robinson. Chapter 47, Rat's Nest. The siblings knew if Kliyd suggested something, then agreeing to that suggestion was a good idea. She wanted them to climb this hill to find shelter in an abandoned building hidden in a crater. Kliyd looked to Mitra as she spoke, assessing if the woman would be capable of the ascent. She wasn't sure what birth was like, and she didn't want to put too much strain on her body. In her brief journey with these siblings, Mitra had experienced a wide variety of emotions. She'd left Silk Rhode almost in a fugue state. She'd continued on, but had resigned herself to the possibility of death at any time. It hadn't mattered who controlled her next, she'd thought, because they'd take away her newborns and kill her. But as these so-called siblings had protected her and tried to escort her to safety, she'd found room to hope for a new life. She'd accept their help and climb this hill. Parts of the ascent were walkable, but other parts featured brambles and rocks and steeper climbs. They were exhausted, but the black vine did make the trek significantly easier. Ricari and Shelfie followed behind to assist Mitra. Niwa commented half-jokingly the group should celebrate with rice and jackfruit once they reached this hidden place. One by one, the siblings came over the ridge and found themselves standing on packed earth. They climbed carefully down rubble that had probably been a rock wall skirting the perimeter at one point. By the light of Niwa's Doha, the group saw some features of the dilapidated buildings that Kliyd had described, and the large statue at the crater's center.
Maybe it's different during the day, but just looking at this hill, you wouldn't know this place was up here.
Aiden's voice projected loudly in the crater's stillness and silence. He lowered his voice.
Are you sure this place is deserted, Kliyd?
Kliyd tensed. Though there were only a handful of old buildings, she'd not scouted the area before regrouping. She'd fully believed the man who called himself Gusk when he called the place abandoned.
I think so,
she said, feeling embarrassed she didn't know for sure. Aiden was too tired to feel overly concerned. Part of him accepted his sister's response as a challenge, a call to see for himself and ensure his family's safety. But when he considered it was too dark to investigate, his body quickly agreed. Niwa ventured over to the wooden building. Peeking through the doorway and shining her light inside, she saw the building had been some sort of dormitory. Piles of debris everywhere made the small building feel even smaller. At the building's rear, a staircase led to an unstable-looking loft. Beside the staircase were 3 freestanding hammocks also made from this black vine. They looked to be the only things well preserved in here.
We can sleep in here, although there may be rats,
Niwa announced to the group. Bringing new information to her family made her feel capable.
Good,
Mitra said quietly. In the darkness, only Ricari was close enough to see her faint grin. He thought this must have been the first time he'd heard the Tikas woman make a joke. When he chuckled, she gave him an approving glance.
Oh, that's not what I meant.
Because Niwa was holding the light source, everyone saw her face turn red from embarrassment.
We did sleep under floorboards,
Kliyd said. Despite her flat affect, she was also teasing her sister. Though she wouldn't have been able to articulate this, a lighthearted joke with another Tikas felt really good. Within minutes, the siblings had claimed hammocks and fashioned bedding out of some ruined materials. The building's entrance had no door, but Aiden found a few loose boards and broken bed frames to barricade the opening. The group unpacked the food Obery had given them and enjoyed a light meal together. Sitting in the ruined building among debris wasn't ideal, but drinking water and eating the remaining jackfruit went a long way to comfort everyone.
I'll keep watch. You all can get some sleep.
Aiden began pacing around the room. He looked at Azaka's wrapped body, placed gently in a corner, and sighed.
Are you sure, Aiden? We all need rest. You look terrible.
Ricari, gathering the remains of everyone's meal, lobbed the scraps through a hole in the wall. He noticed the others watching him.
No need to attract vermin. Rats are fine.
Still got both my arms.
Aiden said. His head was starting to pound.
Stop it!
Niwa said.
Rook is right. We should all get some rest.
I think these vines have been infused with some sort of arcana.
Rikaryu had decided not to respond to his tired brother's jab and was inspecting the hammocks.
I've never seen plant matter solid black like this. It also shows no sign of decay and is surprisingly durable.
He pulled a segment of the hammock tightly to demonstrate, also surprised his turquoise hand had such a strong grip.
Someone in Raven's Cross had a hammock. Do you remember that?
Niwa asked.
I always wanted one, but I think Gorm and Saba both would have had trouble getting in and out of it.
You always wanted a hammock?
Aiden said.
I didn't know that. We could have made one.
We still can.
Niwa offered her brother a small but reassuring smile. She still hoped they could return home.
Aubrey has a hammock. It's near the chicken coop.
While Kliyd spoke, her eyes had panned to the rickety ceiling. She now studied the remains of the small staircase leading to that loft, listening for the sounds of hidden company.
Mitra, would you like to rest in one of these hammocks?
Rikaryu asked.
I think they're quite stable.
I'll be fine here. Thank you.
She reclined atop a pile of clothing remnants and had no interest in moving. The hammock reminded her of a net she'd once been trafficked in. Right now, the giant bobcat sleeping beside her was offering her comfort.
Niwa,
Rikaryu said.
I can help you up if you'd like.
I will if you test one first. They look stable, but the rest of this building is being held together by a few nails and some hope.
Aiden, listening to his sister's quip about their current shelter, found held together and hope resonated with him. He thought about all the detours and wild circumstances his family had encountered since arriving to this place, and he was grateful for the hope holding them together. Chapter 48. Load Bearing. Rikaryu settled into a hammock and began meditating. He'd finished before the sun began to rise, finding no answers to his questions about the djinn. As sunlight poured through holes in the walls of their makeshift dormitory, Rikaryu resumed reading. Thankfully, most of the documents hadn't suffered much water damage from last night's rain. He loved his mother's distinct handwriting, but, for now, he was searching Gorm's spells for anything that could aid their present situation. Kliyd was the first sibling up and about that morning. It wasn't unusual for her to forego a full night's rest. It also wasn't unusual for the young Tikas to wander away from family activities and catch a quick nap during the day, provided her household chores were done. Rikaryu smiled and waved his elven hand when the two made eye contact. He chose not to question or caution his sister as she trod up the remains of the destroyed staircase. Throughout his meditation, he'd not heard a sound from the decrepit loft, and imagined it would be an interesting spot to explore. The nimble Tikas was best suited to access the second level, since its stability was so compromised. She shifted her weight and utilized her tail so as she climbed hardly a post or floorboard creaked. The loft held the broken remains of 5 beds, each with rusted, empty footlockers. She searched each footlocker anyway, then carefully approached a battered door at the far wall. The door had no handle or hardware securing it closed. She pushed against the door, but it didn't budge. She wondered if the door had been barricaded from the other side. Kliyd shoulder-checked herself against the warped door, which yielded, partially opening with a faint creak. On one side, broken chairs were tipped over beside a destroyed table. On the other side was a tall, rusted iron frame still supporting a weathered, soiled bed. Kliyd carefully climbed the frame to gain a better vantage. A skeleton was tied to the 4 corners of the bed frame. Though the restraints had mostly disintegrated, it was clear this body had been tortured. Kliyd saw broken ribs and large cracks in one eye socket, suggesting the victim had been struck by a blunt object. The Tikas was not particularly frightened by what she saw. It didn't occur to her to imagine the torture and feel horrified by it. She was focused on the dagger sticking out of the skeleton at its sternum. The metal blade had a smooth black stone embedded in its black hilt. Curiously, the dagger showed no signs of corrosion or weathering. Kliyd was about to reach for the dagger when she noticed the skeleton's ribs had 2 small bones near it that didn't seem to belong. Kliyd envisioned a finger made from these two bones. It was a fleeting thought that prompted her to look at the skull again. The jawbone was wide open, and she imagined a woman's mouth biting down hard on that finger and spitting it across the bed. The Tikas flinched, turning away. For an instant, she'd seen the colorful bedsheets on which the severed finger had landed. Was she hallucinating again? Unlike before, nobody was communicating directly with her. Also, today she was awake and alert, which never was the case when hallucinations chose to speak with her. When she reached for the dagger a second time, she saw a man's backside. The man was very large, perhaps an orc or a large human. She understood the skeleton was a woman who'd been beneath the man. She'd been tied to the bed, and he attacked her, then raped her. Kliyd stopped hesitating and leaned forward. The man's large hands flashed in her mind. He held that dagger, and blood was pouring from his wounded hand. Then he drove the dagger through the woman's chest. Kliyd had had plenty of experience reacting to Gorm's uncanny image spells during training back home. Like her father's magic, these images were also silent. She suspected the images were some residual effect on either the skeleton or the dagger. Finally, she took the dagger. Meanwhile, Ricario glanced up to see Aiden, asleep in the next hammock, had cold sweat dripping down his face. He was breathing fast and hard. He heard a loud creak as the ceiling on the room's far side began to buckle. The opening chasm delivered a large iron bed, human remains, and his sister, who nimbly tumbled away from the wreckage. Everyone woke up to this catastrophe.
Are you all right?
Niwa hurriedly got out of her hammock to check on Kliyd. Ricario had been wondering the same thing while watching Aiden struggle through sweaty, fitful sleep. He also scrambled out of his hammock to investigate. Shofi also sprang up, then stood by Klyd's side after determining the Tikas had suffered no injuries. Kliyd stood, clutching the dagger. Everyone was watching her. She raised her hand.
I found this.
She said, then sheathed the blade behind her back and dusted herself off. Chapter 49. Delivery. The siblings investigated the skeletal remains, pressing their sister for more information. It was typical of Kliyd only to mention details when specifically asked about them. As no one knew about her past hallucinations or the violent images she'd just seen, she neglected to mention them.
If I knew more about this person, I could try to summon them to ask what happened.
Niwa said.
No offense, Niwa, but I don't think I'd want strangers to summon my ghost, so I could tell them how I was tied up and attacked.
Aiden tried not to sound sarcastic while making what he thought was a fair point.
I would want someone to know, someone who cared.
His sister said, trying not to recall the Tikas skeletons.
I can't believe we slept underneath this torture scene. How awful.
Ricario was thoughtful.
I think whatever happened here must have transpired a long time ago. This person has completely decomposed. Also, there isn't a soul around this place anymore. Although, we could investigate the other buildings nearby if it matters.
Kliyd was idly petting Shofi. Her brother mentioning a soul made her think how in less than one day she'd observed the images of 3 souls, people who'd probably had some connection with this place. She remembered sitting on the roof with Niwa, who'd learned to speak with the spirits of people who also had connections to specific places. When Shofi stood again and walked back to Mitra's side, Kliyd followed her. Aiden, Ricario, and Niwa had begun discussing whether to stay in the crater longer and investigate it, or continue to the Tikas camp. On all fours, Mitra leaned against Aiden's and Ricario's rucksacks as makeshift pillows. She offered Kliyd a small smile. Her eyes reflected her weariness, but also a joy Kliyd hadn't seen before.
It's time.
Mitra said quietly, stretching out her arms and loosening up her shoulders. Shofi sat beside Mitra, offering herself as a support.
What do I do?
Kliyd asked, watching the woman's back moving underneath her lightweight parka. The younger Tikas looked anxious, but spoke calmly. Mitra arched her back.
I'd like for you to keep count and gather any who leave the blanket.
I can do that. Should I tell the others to...
No,
Mitra interrupted.
no audience. This time it is on my terms. I can do this myself, but I'm glad you're here, Kliyd.
I understand.
Kliyd glanced at her siblings. She was surprised they were so invested in their discussion they'd not yet noticed a woman in the same room giving birth. Mitra delivered 10 Tikas pups into the world. Silently, they began to move their hairless little limbs and tails for the first time. 2 pups were, unfortunately, stillbirths. Kliyd only realized the 2 had not survived because Mitra neglected to clean them off. The amateur midwife had bravely assisted with the delivery while suppressing a variety of emotions. She'd held her breath when handling the pups, which had eased her nerves. But when she recognized 2 had failed to draw their own breath, she finally yielded to sobs.
Oh no.
Niwa had heard her sister and finally noticed the newborns. She had exclaimed because she'd missed the big moment, but her brothers thought she was signaling danger.
Please don't.
Mitra said as the siblings hurried over.
I'm fine, honestly.
She tried to sound at ease.
Mitra is well, and this moment is important.
Kliyd shouted at the ground. She faced her siblings, sniffing her last sob away.
We can wait outside, and Shulfi will get us when it's time.
Is that what you want?
Aiden asked loudly to Mitra. His sister was confusing him, but he didn't realize his role just then wasn't to save or defend anyone. Mitra nodded, watching apprehensively for his reaction. She still found the human too forceful, still yelling, and didn't want him aggressively helping. She wanted nothing more than some time alone to bond with her newborns, and was shocked Kliyd had intuited that. Kliyd removed the boards Aiden had used to shutter the entrance and walked out into a bright and sunny day. She expected the others to follow her out.
I can't wait to see the little ones.
Niwa exclaimed cheerfully as she stole one last look to the blanket.
Wait, was that my pack?
Aiden asked Rakaru, who gently ushered his brother out. Kliyd had never seen a live birth before. The pups were Tikas, so she tried to conceptualize what a relation to them should feel like. During their campfire supper, Azaka had discussed the Tikas' plight in this world. The Tikas could reproduce quickly and often, and slavers exploited this capability, effectively breeding Tikas pups into workers as early as possible. Generations soon grew larger and hardier, but their scent and behavior were genuinely Tikas in nature. In the daylight, Kliyd held out her hands, studying them. She understood most early childhood memories were hazy, but she couldn't recall any memories from her earliest years. Only after she came to live with her siblings and Gorham and Saba, it seemed strange she couldn't remember anything about being part of a litter. For the first time, Mitra was a mother to children who weren't immediately taken from her by slavers. She looked to Azaka's wrapped body in the corner. Freedom as a concept still felt unclear to her, but this moment felt more validating than any other that had come before. Chapter 50. Open Air. In the daylight, the siblings could see the land within the shallow crater. Grasses and brush peppered the area like the rest of the hill, growing through the stonework paths. 3 buildings formed a triangle about a large, broken statue.
Who is that supposed to be?
Niwa asked, her head craned towards the sky. The stone statue depicted a person wearing full plate armor. The helm covered the entire head, making it impossible to discern any facial clues.
No idea.
Aiden said.
Nice axe, though.
The statue was twice Aiden's height. Its right arm, including the axe detail, appeared to have broken off some time ago.
This place seems too small to have been a village,
Rakaru said.
The elaborate statue suggests maybe a historical site, or museum, or a temple.
The elf had just noticed the building behind the statue. Though dilapidated, its architecture displayed many symbols and icons. Kliyd, observing every detail of the site, thought the remote location felt both unique and significant. But her main priority was assessing their safety. A glint of light caught her eye, and she noticed the subtle detail in the statue's other hand. The light came from the sun, reflecting off a shiny black object, mostly covered by the stone fingers clenched in a fist. Kliyd guessed this was the reflection she'd seen last night with the Doha's light.
Temples are for gods.
Aiden said self-consciously, thinking of Gorham's unwavering disapproval concerning divine matters.
Rook, are you saying this statue is the likeness of a god?
That looks like a temple.
Rikaru nodded toward the building in question.
One of my novels, Book of Honor, described a temple. Come to think of it, that temple was ruined too. Interesting.
Do you think Azaka would know anything about this place?
Niwa asked. When they'd ignored her initial question about the statue, she'd become frustrated. She thought about heading back inside to grab something to eat and check on Mitra and the pups, but wanted to respect Mitra's privacy.
Niwa, Azaka is dead.
Aiden said.
I don't see how that would help.
I know how to ask him.
Niwa felt snubbed.
I can summon the dead, remember?
Do you think that would work?
Rikaru asked, fascinated.
Oh.
Aiden had changed his tone. Niwa knew he'd warmed to her idea.
Please wait for Mitra.
Kliyd said.
She'll want to speak with him as well.
The Tikas had been half listening while she had studied her new dagger. The black gem of the dagger's hilt was similar to the object the statue grasped. She'd been debating if the statue would support her weight if she climbed it, or if it would collapse like the loft upstairs.
Niwa, does the person need to be dead for the spell to work?
Aiden asked. He'd just come close to asking, why don't you summon Professor Gorham and Miss Saba, before realizing that would imply they were dead. Would he find them on this world soon? Aiden worried their father's spell had partially failed, leaving their parents behind to be killed by those invading their home.
That seems to be how it works.
The gnome said.
Each person in life had some past connection to the place I summoned them.
Are you sure that Mandragora Rose woman was dead?
Rikaru asked.
The way the roadhouse owner discussed her made me assume she wasn't. And we don't know if she had any connection to the valley near Aubrey's house.
Niwa felt indignant to have her brother challenge her, but then she considered what he was saying. She perked up.
Oh, I wish Mandragora Rose weren't dead. Maybe you're right, Rook. But she still disappeared as the rest did, and I just assumed that meant they were dead.
Kliyd had decided not to climb the statue and steal the shiny black object. She'd started walking to a small clearing behind their makeshift dormitory, but paused.
The elf woman was injured in the attack. She fought well, then retreated. She didn't just disappear.
This was the first time she'd discussed the battle. Niwa knew her sister would never intentionally disparage her, but they were all challenging her understanding of how her ability worked. What else didn't she know about the warrior who'd fought alongside her family? Regardless, she wasn't going to let feelings of self-consciousness hold her back from thinking cleverly.
I bet Azaka knew this place. We can ask him when Mitra's ready,
she said.
I'd like that.
Rikaru said, smiling.
Which busted building should we break into next?
Aiden asked facetiously.
The one Rook thinks looks like a temple? Or the stone one, missing pillars and most of a roof? The second one looks less creepy.
We can skip the temple.
Rikaru was also making light of the situation.
Let's search from most to least ruined.
They've all seen better days.
Aiden said as Niwa, Rikaru, and he walked to the stone building.
This door won't budge.
Rikaru grunted. The entrance was constructed of thick wood planks that had weathered and cracked. The elf peered into the building through a crack between the planks and saw sunlight pouring in.
This place is built into the hill.
Niwa checked for a side entrance, but found none.
It reminds me of the houses of Raven's Cross.
Aiden approached to the door, squeezing in before his brother. He wanted to open the door and make the process look easy, but the door's rusted iron handle had no lock or other obvious obstruction.
I'm going to feel terribly embarrassed if you pull on the handle I just tried to push and the door opens,
Rikaru said.
On 3?
Aiden asked with a knowing glance. They counted to 3 and shoved, and the door finally slid open. They flinched, hearing the odd scraping sound that accompanied their effort.
Tell me that was the sound of debris being pushed aside,
Rikaru said uneasily. He'd thought to leap back if the building started collapsing, but there was no further evidence of structural distress. The windowless building smelled of decay, and its partially collapsed ceiling provided plenty of natural light. Aiden, Rikaru, and Niwa stepped over chunks of stone wreckage. The siblings nearly gasped in unison when they noticed the pile of bones behind the door they'd just opened.
Get back!
Rikaru shouted, running back.
What is it, Rook?
Aiden shouted as he and Niwa also fled the building. He'd seen the bones, but not noticed anything else unusual.
That place might be diseased.
Ricardo explained. They'd returned to the statue.
What makes you say that?
Aiden asked.
No one's been up here in a very long time.
As long as those skeletons didn't move.
Niwa tisked. She had also seen the bones, which evoked traumatic memories of the Tika skeletons advancing toward her and Mitra in the valley. The thought of fighting them made her feel nauseated. Kliyd had come running when she heard the commotion. She'd intended to catch up with them as soon as she'd finished a personal errand first. No one had noticed she'd taken the slaver's dagger to dig a hole. Her Tika's hands were covered in dirt.
Oh, sorry.
Ricardo said.
It's just that I've read about how diseases can be spread.
Sounds like a fun read.
Aiden said sarcastically. As someone who couldn't recall ever being sick, he was ready to head back into the building and investigate even if it were full of disease.
Actually, it can be,
Ricardo said.
Diseases can spread through the air. It smells terrible in there. What if they died from a disease? I didn't see any windows in there. Perhaps they'd been trapped inside to die.
What a horrible thought.
Niwa wasn't rebuking her brother for thinking it, but feeling sorrow that it might be true.
We already breathed the air.
Aiden said.
We might as well keep exploring. Look for clues about this place, or supplies for the road ahead.
Ricardo wanted to acquiesce. He realized the giant hole in the ceiling had been letting in fresh air for a long time. If a disease had killed those people, it had likely aired out by now.
You're probably right,
was all he said about the matter. Chapter 51. Mess Hall. As soon as her brother agreed the building was probably free of disease, Kliyd went to the musty building. She wanted to investigate the pile of bones her siblings had been discussing, although she hoped these didn't evoke images of violence for her as the other skeleton had. Her siblings followed her through the hefty wooden door. Trying to ignore the stale smell in the air, they spread out to explore. The interior layout was partially buried in rubble from the collapsed ceiling, but the space clearly had functioned as a galley-style dining room. Long wooden tables and benches lay broken on the stone floor. Broken dishes and cups spilled out of destroyed cabinets in a corner that appeared to have been a kitchen.
I just realized something. Does anyone know what we're supposed to be feeding Shulfi?
Niwa asked while searching the kitchen. The few implements and unbroken dishes were simple and austere. She had no interest in scrutinizing any more skeletons.
Probably meat,
Aiden said.
She's a huge animal, but what would I know? Miss Saba and Professor Gorham were never keen on us having pets. We had skunk.
Aiden, do you think you could take down some local fauna for us? I hear that hills are favorite habitats for wild goats. Maybe pair that with a squab or two on the side.
Ricardo enjoyed teasing his brother about eating meat. He grew up understanding that elves were generally vegetarians. Even without other elves around to enforce this diet, the young mage had never found meat appealing. He was growing tired of searching through the rubble.
We'll just have to ask Azaka,
Niwa said, grinning.
He'll want to see Shulfi and Mitra and the pups. I want to see the pups too.
The gnome chose not to complain about the room's smell and how she'd lost interest in this search. She chose to think of Azaka's cute dimples instead. Kliyd had been searching near the pile of bones, which constituted full skeletons of 3 individuals and no remnants of clothing or personal items that had endured time and the elements. She didn't know how they'd died or why opening the door resulted in them falling into a jumbled heap. She squatted and noticed one skeleton arm sticking out of the pile was mostly intact. The bones of the wrist, hand, and 4 fingers were aligned, but the 5th finger was missing. The voices of her siblings subsided. The daylight pouring in behind her darkened her peripheral vision. An image of 3 people flashed in her mind. She saw their backs as they were running away. They tipped benches. They flailed and stumbled while trying to escape through the walkways between tables. They approached the large wooden door, and the 4-fingered hand reached to open it. Kliyd caught a glimpse of their profiles as they turned to glance back. They were all men, and they were terrified. Kliyd turned to see what the men were seeing. The room was nearly dark, and she initially saw only the ransacked dining hall. Then, hovering in the air, was a ghost gnome woman in ripped clothing. Her ethereal body glowed faintly, and she lurched forward, looking both delighted and disdainful. The man with 4 fingers couldn't open the door in time. The ghost's hand plunged through his back and turned at the wrist. The man's body buckled and fell lifeless to the stone floor. Kliyd watched in horror. The ghost woman then extended both arms out to clutch the other men. She had a large stab wound in her chest. This was the spirit of the woman they'd chained and killed. The ghost grinned as she reached into the men's bodies and rendered them lifeless. Then she scowled before relaxing into a look of indifference or, perhaps, melancholy. She dropped her arms to her side and floated through the heavy door and into the courtyard.
Any clues on the dead guys?
Aiden asked his sister. Kliyd was shaken. As she moved to stand up, she bumped into a few bones that clacked against the stone floor. The noise spooked the Tikas, who nearly fell back on them.
Are you all right?
Aiden knew it was unlike her to appear startled over anything.
This place is awful.
Kliyd dusted herself off and went to the door.
I couldn't agree more.
Niwa said, also walking towards the exit. She hoped the gesture would encourage her brothers to want to leave as well.
There aren't any clues in here.
Aiden stopped to look at the pile of bones.
Although it's strange, these people died over here instead of under the collapsed roof. Not that I wanted to find more dead bodies under there.
Aiden and Niwa went outside. Rokaria was about to exit when he heard Kliyd mutter something that confused him.
They had it coming.
The Tikas said. Chapter 52. Likeness. While rummaging through debris, Niwa had mentally rehearsed for her next summon spell. She expected interacting with Azaka would be a far more exciting and constructive activity. Without her rucksack, the gnome focused on the black object in the statue's hand. The morning sun had reflected off it, drawing her attention to its shine.
Champion of nature, the halfling ranger Azaka and his faithful animal companion Shelfie scattered the lands to rescue and resettle the Tikas people.
Niwa grinned, satisfied, speaking those words loudly on the hill. She wondered if mentioning the living bobcat would complicate or nullify her spell. As if on cue, a beam of sunlight shined brightly near the statue. Azaka flickered, then coalesced before them. He looked entirely confused.
I'm getting good at this.
Niwa stepped forward eagerly.
How's it I'm in this place?
Azaka looked down at his halfling body, then noticed his former adventuring companions gathered around him, and smiled.
My eyes best not deceive me now. I always knows the good ones when I sees 'em.
The siblings, delighted, greeted Azaka warmly. Only a day had passed, and yet there was so much to discuss with him. At moments, they forgot they were interacting with a summon spell. At other moments, the siblings' new arcana couldn't seamlessly replace real life. Seeing the halfling again brought up some difficult feelings for Aiden. He felt compelled to apologize for his reckless actions, to let Azaka know he was going to do better and never fail again. But he couldn't find the words. Something held him back. While Azaka was the same jovial soul they'd come to trust, he spoke as though everything they'd experienced together had happened a long time ago.
Afraid I don't know this place here.
Azaka said, regarding the surrounding buildings and statue. Curiously, he didn't inquire about the campus further and didn't seem to absorb much of what they told him about it. Rokaria wanted to give Aiden and Niwa opportunity to speak with the halfling. This Azaka represented a collection of past details and knowledge, and this, he decided, was the distinction between past and present, life and death.
We are near the Tikas camp, I think,
Rokaria said. He knew their time with Azaka was limited and was afraid they'd not get to ask him their pressing questions.
Azaka, if we walk to the slope, could you point it out from up here?
Kliyd recalled Gusk, the hobgoblin from last night. He'd mentioned one could probably spot the hidden Tikas camp from up here. Azaka looked at the elf quizzically but walked to the edge of the shallow crater, answering a question Niwa had just asked.
You got nothing to bother about with a bobcat. Lone hunters they be. Can even go a good while between a meal. I done trained a primeval bobcat in my time. They hunt on their own, and you ain't seen a better companion to protect the Tikas, especially the baby ones. Guard with their lives they do. Magnificent.
Niwa hadn't mentioned Shelfie by name, and the halfling didn't seem to recognize this was the primeval bobcat in question. Rikaryu remembered when his sister chose to summon the former roadhouse's owner. That man had recalled his wife, asking to see her again. He wondered if Shelfie, still being alive somehow, had muddled Azaka's memories. As the group passed the building where Mitra was rearing her newborns, Shelfie appeared in the doorway to investigate who was coming closer. She tilted her head slightly, but otherwise reacted with pure indifference.
Shelfie was my best companion there ever was.
Azaka said joyfully when the bobcat stepped into the sunlight.
Rook, I can try to point you all in the general way, but this girl can get you there, no problem. Isn't that right, lovely?
He reached out to pet his bobcat behind the ear. The bobcat sniffed and allowed Azaka to pet her. She felt uncomfortable seeing her companion, unable to detect his scent. She displayed no signs of affection, and after a few seconds slowly walked back to Mitra's side. At this point, all the siblings were concerned about the summon spell. They'd not expected the reunion to feel so superficial, but they forgot their disappointment after going inside and seeing Mitra's newborn litter.
They're beautiful.
Niwa said, walking towards the blanket. When Shelfie approached her, staring hard, she realized the primeval bobcat was as protective as advertised. The gnome admired the pups from afar.
Azaka.
Mitra said to the halfling, then hesitated. She'd seen Niwa summon a great fighter yesterday during the ambush, and earlier had overheard her discussing trying again. Now she assumed the second try had succeeded.
You're not ready to leave for camp yet, are you?
Aiden asked, his tone suggesting he wasn't ready to leave yet.
Aiden.
Niwa said, lightly scolding her brother. She did notice the newborns hadn't yet opened their eyes. She also hoped the halfling didn't see his former body lying in the corner.
You don't want to be moving pups that young,
Azaka said.
Actually a shame how fast they grow up. No time to be kids. Mama says the Tika's been bred over generations to be bigger and stronger and have lots of litters. Says it ain't always been like that. But the evil ones want more work as fast as possible. Them pups will be standing a bit in maybe 2 days. Maybe then y'all could get them to camp.
Kliyd's eyes widened. Suddenly, this world made a lot more sense to her. She'd suspected the Tikas here were so much larger and wild-looking because slavers had bred successive generations of them for hard labor. She made eye contact with Mitra. Did she know about anything Azaka had just described? As Mitra looked back at Kliyd, she did seem to understand their different fates. The differences might have taken years, or even centuries, but the effects could now be seen simultaneously.
Y'all got enough food here?
Azaka walked over to Mitra. His bobcat remained sitting at alert, but didn't react defensively to his approach.
The pups will take milk, of course, but new mama has got to keep up strength. I don't know where my pack is gone, but I keep a bunch of ready seeds for the road. Jackfruit is a big favorite. Oh, and lots of water, too, for certain.
At the mention of water, Aiden and Rikaryu looked at each other. Both thought about getting drenched the night before. It had been scary and frustrating, but the memory was almost comical now. Azaka had no scent. Mitra sniffed and thought she'd feel more of a comfort in his presence, but that feeling never came. The newborn pups were gathered beside their mother. Besides a few tiny stretches and yawns, none reacted to Azaka's presence. One pup, nestled before Mitra, appeared premature compared to the others. Though his eyes remained closed, that small pup reached out a tiny hand to the halfling. Azaka allowed the baby Tikas to hold his finger. Everyone was charmed and surprised, except for Azaka, who smiled until the baby withdrew his hand.
May the spirit of nature watch over you and the children, and guide you through a new era for the Tikas, to make their own destiny,
the halfling said warmly to Mitra. He placed a hand gently on the bobcat's head and petted behind her ears, then walked back to the doorway. Azaka's blessing gave everyone an unexpected feeling of peace and confidence. For a brief, auspicious moment, it felt like the proper reunion they'd all hoped for. Aiden, watching Azaka head outside, wondered if the subject of a summon spell knew when the effect would cease.
Zach!
Aiden panicked when Azaka didn't respond. Then he realized his mistake and jogged to catch up. He circled around so that the halfling could now read his lips.
Zach, I wanted to ask you a few things.
Go on, then.
Azaka remained as pleasant as ever.
Aubrey said someone else was coming to visit her soon. I think she meant someone from the Tikas camp. Do you know who she was talking about?
Could be anyone. We all used to take turns visiting Aubrey, but not too many of us running the camp. Good and all that the circle was small, you know. Easier keeping the camp a secret.
Aiden, frustrated, thought to ask the halfling to get to the point. But maybe what Azaka was saying was still useful.
Azaka, what do you think happens to a person after they leave the world?
Rikaryu's analytical mind still struggled to accept their friend was really gone, and he thought Azaka's answer might reassure him. His siblings looked at him, surprised and confused.
A natural order carries us all,
Azaka said.
There ain't nothing to fear. The world be full of life and death, and the ones who cause the death think they be strong, but they ain't. Real strength is helping and protecting the lives of the rest of us, and we all get carried together. When one season ends, the next begins. A body returns to the ground, and next season the body be a new tree, reaching for the sun. Make the most with what you get. That's all.
You make me feel better when you say things like that.
Niwa said, thinking of her parents as tears formed in her eyes. She realized Azaka, facing her brothers, hadn't noticed her speaking. Then the halfling turned and looked at her, smiling so warmly just as her summon spell expired. A breeze swept through the clearing, and the siblings stood together in front of the broken statue. On the next episode, the family celebrates the birth of Mitra's pups, and the event finally happening is nothing short of a miracle. The group still needs to make it to the Tikas camp, but continuing on needs to wait.
Zach said the pups need more time.
Aiden suggests the siblings continue to investigate their strange surroundings.
Aiden, this place is a total disaster. Of the 2 buildings we've been in so far, the ceiling has collapsed on both of them. I'm seeing a pattern.
Rikaryu might be persuaded to explore with his brother.
Does that mean you'll go with me, Rook?
The only building they haven't explored looks like a temple, but Gorm and Saba have said the gods don't exist. What's in the last building?
Is there anyone in there?
Chapter 53, Columns. Next time on Across the Sun. Across the Sun Episode 10 was voiced by Danielle Bouchard as Kliyd, Julia Boudreau as Niwa, Bill Robinson as Aiden, Jason Pagano as Rikaryu, Sarah Luz as Mitra, and Daniel Neal as Azaka. Narrated by, edited, scored, mixed and mastered by Thomas Wells. Some sound effects and music acquired from Zapsplat.com.